Welcome back. This week we'll be looking at the phenomenon known as Pacheco culture in the Mexican American community. You will be watching a documentary that looks at the Sleepy Lagoon and the Zoot riots, but before you watch it, I want to give you a bit of context and background as to what kind of shapes this movement and really the subculture. It's not really a movement, but the subculture in places like Los Angeles. So we'll look into different ideological ideas. So please pay attention because I might get a little bit too philosophical here. That's not my intent. I try to make it as simple as possible, but sometimes students get confused. So if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email about it. Just quickly show you this cartoon of a comic strip in a newspaper. And here we see how something that was very concentrated in small communities, right? And by small communities, I mean just like, subcultures, eventually blows up, and all of a sudden you see this style everywhere, and we even see it in cartoons here. But the Zoot itself, kind of shows up in different parts of American culture. So I want you to understand that when it comes to a lot of times when it comes to subgroups, a lot of time it's a reflection of the way groups see themselves in the context of society. A good comparison would be, say, punk music and really punk culture. You might not understand it, you might not like them, but they are reflecting on something that's happening in society at a particular moment in time. And just to kind of quickly address that, in the 1970s and 80s, England in particular is going through really economic hard times where you find limited opportunities, particularly for a new generation that's coming of age. And the punk culture is a reflection of those type of politics. And you see it eventually kind of spread to the United States. We probably weren't as bad, at least not economically, as England, yet you have punk groups show up here, such as Blondie, right? Blondie started off as a punk group. The Ramones, Dead Kennedys, and all these other kind of groups that took off. So with this particular culture, we kind of see the same thing, that it starts off very small, but then eventually kind of blows up. But it is a reaction to certain conditions that are shaping it. Nothing comes out of a vacuum. So let's begin. And we begin by looking at Mexican identity. So Chicano scholars have made a connection between what's happening in Mexico in the 1930s and what's happening in Los Angeles in the 1940s. So this kind of Pachuco subculture, according to Chicano scholars, is influenced by the way kind of Mexicans see themselves in kind of urban spaces such as Mexico City. And it is best exemplified by this guy, right? Cantinflas. I'll try to find a clip that kind of showcases this identity. And you could kind of see how Cantinflas emulates what this writer was talking about what it means to be Mexicano in the 1930s. Now, after the Mexican Revolution, Mexico is struggling to understand itself. I mean, you just came out of a 10-year war, basically, right? A civil war. And they're trying to rebuild and trying to understand who they are. So one of the arguments that I presented earlier during the immigrant generation is that Vasconcelos, right? I think it's Jose Vasconcelos, where he argued that the Mexican is, the best there is out there, right? That is kind of what they call cultural nationalism, right? Where because he's mestizo, right? He's white, he's European, he's indigenous, he's African, he's Asian. He's the best of everything. It makes him, superior to any other group out there. Better than the American, better than the European, better than the, anybody else in the world. Now, at the same time, so that's, for many Mexicanos, they're kind of proud of that, right? Yeah, Mexicans are better than everybody else. So they'll be proud of that. But there's other people who are kind of challenging that perspective. And one of them is this man, it's actually two of them, or it's a few of them, but one of them is Samuel Ramos. And another one's Octavio Paz, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But Samuel Ramos writes this essay called The Profile of Man and Culture in Mexico. And in this essay, he's trying to more or less talk about how Mexico needs to move forward. And he's trying to appeal to a middle class. But by doing so, he's kind of presenting the current status of the Mexicano in the 1930s. And he focuses on this person called El Pelado. Now, this is a generic term. It's not a particular person specifically. But he sees Mexico very much so as a very kind of, you have a rich class, you have a poor class, and obviously you have a larger poor class, and you have a very small middle class. So Samuel Ramos is trying to appeal to the lower classes and to the middle class, saying, look, we could be more if we can get rid of this identity of El Pelado, right? So he's kind of critical of El Pelado. And he describes El Pelado in very negative terms. He says, he basically calls him an urban animal, right? And he's someone to kind of fear. And he uses this kind of specific descriptive qualities that he says, the Pelado, the urban poor man, is resentful, he's hostile, he's intellectually primitive, physically and verbally abusive, extremely sensitive to criticism, and very easily provoked. So he sees a Pelado in very negative terms, in other words, right? So when I show you that video of Cantinflas, hopefully you kind of make this connection. Now, Cantinflas kind of challenges this. So he does have some of these qualities, but at the same time, he comes off as a very positive model of this concept of El Pelado, right? And there's a quote from his book that says, he's rebellious and immature adolescent who lacked the self-knowledge necessary to react to his surrounding in a civilized and productive manner. So he's saying, like, Mexicanos, we need to get out of this rut, right? We can't be behaving like this forever, because then everybody else is going to surpass us. Other nations are going to surpass us if we kind of behave in this manner. So he's kind of advocating for progress, if you will. Now, understand that this is the way kind of Mexico sees itself at this particular moment. So Chicano scholars have kind of said, well, this is what the Pachuco kind of resembles to some extent. And it comes from our mother culture, right? Our people that migrated from Mexico to the United States. And like I said earlier, Cantinflas kind of represents this concept very, very well. So when I show you the video, hopefully you understand Spanish. If you don't, you can at the very least watch the video. It'll be a small clip, and see how somebody who has nothing is able to get away with everything, right? That's what you end up seeing in most of his movies, right? He's very savvy, he's very street smart, and can kind of manipulate the situation to his advantage. And that's why people kind of like him so much. Kind of like the underdog that subverts the system, if you will, which is what Ramos was kind of arguing against. So it's kind of interesting how that kind of happened. So now we're going to examine the Zoot itself and how this connects to Mexican Americans. And with the Zoot itself, we have to understand that the Zoot is not something that came from the Mexican American community. There's actually three things, right? We're talking about El Pelado, the Zoot, and Mexican Americans. And these three come together in the 1940s to form the Pachuco. So the Zoot itself comes from the African American community. Here's a newspaper article that highlights when the first Zoot was created, and this is debatable, but at the very least it gives us a reference in regards to the 1940s. And as we can see, it came from the African American community. So jazz culture really influences the culture in general, American culture in general. So that's where the Zoot itself comes from. And many Mexican Americans during this time, and even Anglo Americans, or even what we would label during this era, hyphenated Americans, would go to African American communities to go listen to their music, or they would go down, particularly in Los Angeles, they would go down to Central Avenue, where these groups would kind of commingle, and there's dance clubs, and they would, have a good time, have fun, right? Basically, go down to a club. And this is something that's kind of unique because their parents, particularly of these hyphenated Americans, would not go to these areas, right? Mexican Americans' parents would stay in their barrio because they felt comfortable in their community because they felt they have everything they needed there. Now, the word pachuco itself, it's a slang term, right? It's not something that most people would have called themselves in Mexico. There is a city called Pachuca, but I don't think that has any connection with this particular term. Now, the word itself referenced someone that was born in El Paso. So somebody would say, él es del Pachuco, kind of meaning that he is from El Paso. But the word also kind of takes a different connotation to have this meaning that is associated with somebody who is an outsider, right? Somebody that's in the fringes of the community or in the fringes of society, right? So the word pachuco begins to have, I don't want to say a negative connotation, but it does have elements of that, right? And eventually, because it kind of mimics the Mexican American identity, the word itself, pachuco, becomes almost synonymous with Mexican American. So we will see that when we talk about Octavio Paz and the way he views Mexican Americans, and he kind of uses the word pachuco and Mexican American interchangeably, right? They basically mean the same term. Now, Octavio Paz, I mentioned him a few minutes ago in the previous slide, in regards to how Mexicans see themselves in the first half of the first half of the 20th century. So we talked about El Pelado, and that was like right after the Mexican Revolution, 20s, 30s. But then in the 50s, you have this other significant writer named Octavio Paz. Probably the best well-known Mexican writer because he actually gets a Nobel Prize for his book of Labyrinth of Solitude. And within this book, he has an essay called Pachucos and Other Extremes. In this essay, what he's trying to do is, like Ramos, trying to understand what it means to be Mexican. And in doing so, he creates, he doesn't create, but he writes an essay that kind of creates these two different categories of the Mexican versus the Mexican American. So we talked at the beginning of the semester the whole postmodern theory of object subject. Well, here's a good example of that, where Octavio Paz sees the Mexican as the object and the Mexican American, or the Pachuco, as the subject, right? The object is what's superior, the subject is inferior. And in this essay, so he writes the Mexican American as the antithesis of the Mexican, right? And he talks about the Pachuco as being a clown. He calls him a clown partly because of the way that he looks. He's very exaggerated in his clothing, in his style, in his demeanor, in his talk. In his walk, right? Everything about him is exaggerated, and according to Paz, he's somewhat of a clown character. And he calls the Mexican American, the Chicano or the Pachuco, that as somebody who is neither Mexican nor American. Now, in this element, Octavio Paz is very critical, and there's a sense that he almost feels, and this is really how society felt at this time, that people should choose one or the other, right? Either you assimilate into American culture or you maintain your Mexican culture. And he says, well, the Mexican American or the Pachuco is neither, right? He's just this anomaly just kind of floating around in this hybrid world. But he also kind of taunts them, saying the Mexican American or the Pachuco rejects both cultures, right? The Mexican American doesn't want to be one or the other. And now he doesn't understand the context of this. This is just him being critical. Obviously, racism and just this sense of being different from his parents kind of works in this identity construction. But Octavio Paz doesn't really care for those type of issues. He just says, look, this Mexican American is just some weirdo, basically, right? He's not Mexican and he's not American. And he also says, the Mexican American lacks culture, basically, right? He doesn't have a tongue, he doesn't have a religion, doesn't have any customs. The Mexican has their traditions, right? Their food, their language, and so forth. The Americans have theirs, but the Mexican Americans have neither. Even though they're creating their own culture, Octavio Paz sees it as some kind of bastard culture. And he finally kind of says, all you have is a body and a soul, right? You have this kind of empty shell that exists in no man's land. And then he kind of continues saying, look, the Mexican American or the Pachuco wears this kind of over-exaggerated outfit. And this outfit protects them and it makes them vulnerable. And this sounds like a contradiction, which it is, right? And what he meant by this is that it protects them because it allows them to participate in a subculture, right? There's other people wearing the Zoot suit. There's other people that talk the same language of Galo. So he's able to, the Mexican American or the Pachuco is able to integrate into this subculture, right? He's with people that are like him, right? But it also makes him vulnerable because he sticks out like a sore thumb in mainstream culture, right? He doesn't quite fit into the the American culture or even the Mexican culture, right? So if you were to walk into any of these two communities, you could probably tell that he wasn't comfortable in these spaces. And during this period, you have to understand that the Zoot suit was very expensive to make too. So you also have that World War II politics playing a role because material was being rationed out, and the Mexican American or the Pachuco was spending a lot of money, and for many it seemed like they were not helping in this war effort. So Octavio Paz is very critical of the Zoot suiter. So it's not so much that we agree with him, but we do use him to try to understand how Mexican Americans felt in the 1940s. So actually all Mexican American historians today would disagree with Octavio Paz. All right. So now let's look at the Pachuco in greater detail. So what is a Pachuco or a Pachuca? And here's a cool picture of the women too, right? That participate in the subculture. Well, it depends who you ask in the 1940s, right? Who is a Pachuco? Now, according to the press, both Anglo press, so Anglo newspapers, and Mexican newspapers such as La Opinión, they completely hate the Pachuco just as much as Octavio Paz does. And they're very critical. For men, both the Anglo press in particular, calls them lazy. They're kind of curious as to where the heck did they get this money to buy this expensive suit, because the Zoot suit itself is fairly expensive. It kind of it's very critical of them because they feel that the suit, if you're wearing a suit, today it's quite different, but there is this idea of wearing a suit that gives the perception that you're middle class. Obviously, the suit that they wore was very baggy and big. But for many people in the white press, they believe that they were trying to become something that they were not. In other words, they were trying to become middle class when they were not welcome into the middle class, right? When you wear a suit that obviously costs some money, but also you wear it to like business type of places. And obviously these Mexican Americans were not businessmen, they were just a youth. The press was very critical of that, saying, look, you're trying to cross these boundaries into places that you don't belong to. They're also called unpatriotic, and you'll see that in the documentary. and they were called as communist and Nazi agents, even though these pachucos had no idea what maybe communism was at this time, or even Nazi ideology, But what the press is trying to do is show them that they were not geared up for the war effort in this period. They were also called very, very much so as they're perceived as dandies, and this is almost like a cue towards homosexuality. These men were too pretty, and not pretty in the sense that they were attractive, but in the sense that they spent too much time on their attire and the way they look. So they perceive them as dandies, right? That they took too much care of themselves, even though it's interesting because a lot of times the things that they're saying is very contradictory, because they're saying they were dirty, right? They were lazy, but then saying all these other things, saying, well, they comb their hair way too much, right? It was always in the perfect coif. They paid way too much attention in their outfits, right? That everything was in place, that everything was perfectly ironed. So these statements are so contradictory at times, but a lot of it is just to minimize them, right? And to kind of show them who's boss. And put them in their place. Mexicans, you belong here and don't move from there, basically is what they're trying to say. Here's a quote from one of the newspapers where it says, male Zoot suitors pay too much attention to their hair and their clothing and too little to athletics and their studies. Again, saying like you're just too, you're just always grooming yourself and you're not even that strong, or things like that, right? And they're calling them lazy too because they're not studying. For women, they're often presented as exotic sexual beings. So they were presented as promiscuous, delinquents, right? Dangerous, always sharp looking, well dressed, but also as prostitutes. I was reading an article that noted, this is by the newspapers, both by Anglo newspapers and Mexican newspapers. So the Anglo newspapers presented them as these women that were always in the mood for sex, and if they didn't get it from their men, they would take out a knife and force them to have sex with them. So it's kind of ridiculous, but again, this is a perception of white newspapers. Now, when it comes to Latino or really Mexican newspapers, at this time it's La Opinión, they were very critical of the way that they looked because they did not adhere to these kind of middle class aspirations that their parents were trying to follow. So again, they were caught in this middle ground where they became a very, very much so a subculture. So they struggled in regards to their identity. So again, this quote, it says, many of these pachuquitas were little tornadoes of sexual stimuli swishing and flouncing down the street. And kind of like the men, right? They took good care of themselves, their hair, their clothing. Obviously, not too many wore the suit. This one's kind of cool because she is wearing the suit here. But many of them wore skirts that were above the knee, or back then showing this much leg was very taboo, right? The reality, though, were these people like anything that the newspapers described them as? No, right? They were just kids. White people were probably doing the same thing, right? African American young youth were doing the same thing. This was part of a movement that was happening throughout the world, really, particularly the Western world, where we see people buying the Zoot suit because they're influenced by African American jazz culture. It's also symbolic of the Mexican American generation, right? This generation is a generation that is going against their parents' culture and American culture, and they're creating something new. They're creating this subculture by taking different aspects of Americana, right? By Americana, I mean all the different cultures that exist at this time. And this is not unique to this particular either group or even this generation. We see this happening in the 1900s with places such as Coney Island. I teach in my women's history class, I teach prostitution. And you have something called the Bowery Gal in the 1940s, where they take up the clothing of prostitutes. And a lot of times it's working class people or lower class people who like this fashion, and they emulate it. And eventually it filters down to the masses and it becomes part of everyday culture, right? I mean, just think of something like tattoos. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, nobody, people who had tattoos were like troublemakers, right? And today you see mothers, right? Suburban housewives with a tattoo. And you better be careful. They might shank you or something, right? But no, it's become very mainstream where, everybody has a tattoo and it's no longer a big deal. I think I heard some 90-year-old lady got a tattoo recently because it was part of her bucket list. Now, the pachuco is very much so a reaction to American racism, right? They feel alienated by the educational system, right? Remember, we have school segregation at this time. They're not welcome into certain neighborhoods. They've basically been kicked to the curb. So they feel like they have very limited opportunities, so they create their own world. And it's also a challenge to their parents' culture because their parents don't quite understand them because, again, they're part of this hyphenated generation who want more out of life. And are kind of critical of their parents' culture, particularly women, right? Because they have very traditional gender roles, and these women who are working, making money, have higher expectations of opportunities that they see available to them. So I want to show you some quick pictures and just some quotes. I actually interviewed a Pachuco back in the 1990s for a class that I had to do a paper for. And his name was Ezekiel Oropesa. He used to be a man that used to come visit my dad all the time at his shop. And they used to just talk and drink beer. And he was like, God, he must have been like in his 80s in the 1990s. So he was born in the 1920s. So he was a Pachuco in the 1940s. He wasn't part of the Zoot riots because he actually joined the military and he was in World War II. And he says, in one time on Soto Street and Whittier, the White Fence, which is a gang, one of the oldest gangs in Los Angeles, they grabbed some kid, they beat him up, throwing them onto the cement. They would turn them around with their face facing the cement, and would kick the back of their heads. When they would turn around, all you would see is a bunch of broken teeth. So sometimes Pachucos were associated with gang affiliation, and I was reading a study that kind of said that in El Paso, these people that were called Pachucos would engage in had some kind of gang affiliation, and they moved to Los Angeles and brought that culture there. Here you'll see this in the video, the Sleepy Lagoon case. Here's not only is it a fashion style, but it's also an attitude, and you see it here, right? The way he's standing with that foot forward, that kind of head held up high, and obviously wearing the Zoot suit. So this guy was the essence of cool, if you will. More pictures. Again, Sleepy Lagoon case right here, and you see the baggy pants, the big coat, right, and the ducktail hair, the way they kind of comb their hair. Was a defining style of the era. You also have pachucas, and I already showed you a picture, but again, Zeke talks about some of these women that he used to hang around with. He says, these women wore dresses, some short, some long. They had long hair. You saw that in the picture, but I'll show you some more. That they would raise up and would stick knives in it, because when they got in fights, they would just take it out and cut you with it. So, these were tough girls. Some of them did have knives, not all of them. But, again, probably don't want to mess with them. And here you see the style, the pachucas. These women were part of the Sleepy Lagoon case, and you see that pompadour type of hairstyle. Nice cardigan sweaters. I mean, today this is so innocent, right? I mean, I wouldn't find these women threatening at all. And here you see them, again, Sleepy Lagoon, with this woman wearing the Zoot suit, the big coat, the baggy pants. which is again very unique. You don't see too many women wearing the zoot suit during this period. He mentions this one time where these women, were very much so a force to be reckoned with, and a lot of it had to do with the American, again, this alienation that they had to survive on their own. He states, we went in 2 cars with 5 guys and 5 girls. We sat at a bar, and and the gang walked in. Right away, we knew there were going to be a problem, so the girls got up and stood in front of the guys, and then we followed with me in the middle. The girls were just as tough as any guy, and that day they protected us. They would defend us whenever we were outnumbered. So just again showcasing the idea that these women participated in this subculture. And here you see another picture with a woman wearing the zoot suit. Kind of like this one more, because her pants are much more baggier than this. As the video noted, that this is during the time of World War II when this phenomenon happened. And material is expensive, right? Because everybody's gearing up for the war effort. So this is part of the reason why pachucos and pachucas were seen as anti-American or communist, because in the middle of the war where things were being rationed out, they were buying these suits. So they felt that they were not participating in this major event called World War II, even though they were participating. Some of them were military people who joined the military, went out into battle, and maybe they might have come, they just kind of served their time and were here and just put on their suit. Now, pachucos also had their own language. As I said, the word pachuco comes from, kind of renaming El Paso. This is nothing unique. You all have your own language, right? If you text, you probably create your own words. So some certain people might not identify them, right? Particularly your parents. So, these kids were no different, right? They create their own language called Calo. And I quickly want to go through some terms, because this actually comes from a study from the 1930s, late 30s, like 39. And it's a white anthropologist from USC who goes into the barrio and interviews people to find out some of these words. And some of these words are still being used, others are not. So it makes them kind of interesting. So I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. But, agüitarse, this is a word you probably are familiar with because it's still in use, and it means to be sad. Not that agüites, right? Aranarse, this one I don't really hear too much, but I had students know it. And it means to sit, to get married, or to get ruined, which, that's what marriage does to you, right? So I think it's kind of funny. Bato, bata, and he writes it with a B. Remember, this is an Anglo writing this information down. I think I seen it with a V, but this is a word that we still use today, meaning dude. Birria, this is something, Italians use this word. So obviously it's a food in Mexico, but it also means beer, right? In Italy in particular, if you ever go there, say birria and they'll bring you beer. Carnal, this is a word that's still in use. It means brother. Chero means police. I think this derives from sheriff. So some of these words might have Spanish meanings. Some of them might have English meanings. Others we just don't know. Some anthropologists have argued that it might have Nahua influences in it, which Aztec. Chale we still use, right? It means forget about it, right? Frajo means cigarette. Gomitar, and this one's kind of funny, right? Because it's actually with a V, but he wrote it with a G. But a lot of times, as Mexican Americans, we don't speak Spanish that well, so we kind of come up with our own words, such as parquear, right? Parquear is not a real word, but if I were to say it to any Chicano, they go, oh yeah, parquea el carro allá en la frente de la casa, or something like that, right? Or yarda, en frente de la yarda, which again, these are not real words, but are become part of our language, because we take English words and make them into Spanish. So it means vomitar means to vomit. Conexión, Greta, and I think it's Yesca with a Y. And some of these people did do this. Some of these pachucos, they did smoke marijuana, so they had a word for it. And I mean, we do the same thing, right? Weed and all that good stuff. Pirujo, it means asshole. Cirol, Simón is probably used mostly today, but Cirol used to be used back in the 1930s and 40s. It means yes, right? Simón ese, right? Tirili, this word has completely disappeared, but it means somebody that's smooth, right? Somebody that's a cool dude, or somebody that's Mexican American. I think only one student has ever heard this where they actually got it right in the 12, 13 years that I've been here. Tolologo, it means not in fashion. And tramados means your pants, right? And quickly, I want to go through some dichos. Caer sura, so these are kind of expressions that they would have used to fall in bad favor. Sura, it almost sounds like sour. I'm not sure if it comes from that though. Sabinas, and this is a word that's still used. It means to know, sabes, right? And they kind of put their own twist on it. Estar como rifle, it refers, I mean, the literal translation is to be like a rifle, right? But it means to figure up a woman, the shape of a woman. Tirarle a un león, to be make fun of. Trabajar la lana, so this means to work in the cotton field. But here means to pick cotton. A lot of times today I think people say a la lana, or tienes lana, means like, do you have money? But it derives from Mexican Americans working in Texas, out in the cotton fields during this time. Estar fuera de la chaveta, to be acting all crazy. Tirar chancla, maybe this is what your mom does, right? When she's angry at you. And it means to dance. Ponerse al alba, to be alert. Apachurar la oreja, it means to sleep, right? Because you're pushing your ear onto your pillow. All right. So these are just some words that I wanted to, kind of show you of, just kind of sound kind of interesting. It's part, again, of the subculture that creates their own language. It's nothing unique because subcultures always do this, as we all know, at sometimes in our teen years, we all came up with words. Even a word like cool, right? Cool means cold, yet we use it in a different way. So in conclusion, what do we learn? We find that the Pacheco phenomenon is very much so reflective of the cultural exchange that's happening amongst all these youths, African American, Anglo American, and Mexican American, in places like downtown LA, right? They're all coming together, they're seeing, they're looking, they're being influenced by each other, and it shapes their culture. So, and this is a very natural process, right? It's not like cultural appropriation today. This is just something that they notice, and then one person wears it, and it just kind of blows up after that. I mean, if you want to call it cultural appropriation, you can, but it's a little bit different. And in doing so, they create a new subculture, the Pacheco phenomenon. Again, the video does a nice job explaining it, maybe in greater detail. And they also create their own language, as we see with Galo. But understand that it's not just kids wanting to be cool, right? Kids wanting to rebel for the sake of rebelling, right? They're actually doing it because they're reacting to the racism that they're encountering. Again, they're not welcome into American mainstream society. It could be argued, had America accepted us as they should have with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, right, that made us full citizens, had they accepted us, none of this would have happened, right? But because we're segregated, because we don't have economic opportunities into certain job markets, because we're not welcome, we have to fend for ourselves, and we create something new. And at the same time, we don't feel like we're Mexican, right? Our Mexican culture, yeah, we take elements of it, but it doesn't define who we are. So we're also kind of reacting to that too. All right. So I'll stop it there. Make sure to watch the documentary. I'll probably have some questions that are associated with the documentary, so make sure to answer those. And hope you enjoyed at least kind of learning a little bit about the history of pachucos.